Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath, Bow Wow, welcoming you back to more Archon's Armory, Power Armor Edition. Now, I know it's been a little bit. I gave you a couple of cooling off days, but now it's time to get back into the swing of things. I hope this video won't be too long, but I'm going to do my best to analyze whatever I can. Now, on to the mythos. Now, the power armor is very much a victim of the aforementioned Space Marine effect. Anything that touches the God Emperor's oh-so-holy Astartes, or to a lesser degree their chaos-influenced counterparts, becomes immortalized, iconic, picturesque, and perfect, in a way that puts many fans in a false assumption about this equipment. So let's try and disambiguate just a little bit. The pinnacle of protection. Well, of course, the existence of Terminator armor alone would prove that power armor is not the pinnacle of all protection, but just in general, power armor is very good. It is the top of the line. It is some of the best available in the Imperium, but it is by no means utterly impregnable, and it's nowhere close to the pinnacle of what the Imperium or what 40k can provide in general. It is a comfortable middle ground of the elite upper class of armors. Invulnerable to small arms. Now, this is kind of a general thing that's held by a lot of different folks. The idea that power armor, its main goal is to simply make you not care about a majority of weapons in the hands of your opponents. This is slightly true, slightly false, if I'm being honest, because power armor is intentionally crafted to protect you all over your body from a vast variety of threats. However, it is still physical armor. It has joints, weak spots, thin areas, and of course, like any other piece of equipment, it suffers wear and tear, battle damage, and there are weapons specifically designed, or unintentionally designed, to damage, break down, or destroy power armor, and of course the Astartes, or the individual using it. Now, bouncing versus protecting. This really has to do with the idea that some people have that power armor doesn't really take damage all that much. You see all the time, quite often in animations or in videos or in analysis, that power armor, especially the more heavily armored sections of it, just remains impeccable and undamaged. And these wonderful paragons of humanity are just walking through fields of fire without ever receiving so much as a scratch. And while that is true in some cases, I would actually like to point you to this gentleman's stern guard in front of us. I'm not exactly familiar with what the Ultramarines term this gentleman. I believe he's a shield captain or some sort of captain. I apologize to the Ultramarines fans. I specifically know quite a few of them who are definitely yelling at me for not knowing this gentleman's rank, but I would like to point out some things on his armor. While he may look pristine on the surface, you will notice gouges, cuts, scratches, chinks in his armor, areas of flaked paint and crushed ceramite, and more importantly, what you notice is that these are battle damage, and we will be talking about battle damage and about progressive damage as we go further and further into armor protection. But in general, the term protects you from enemy weapons should really be replaced in almost all cases with all body armor with resists. Because, of course, if you fire in the same position over and over and over again, no matter how thick the armor is, no matter what it's made out of, no matter what, essentially, you will penetrate eventually. It's merely about speed and efficiency. Now, that may not hold true for certain armor, but it most certainly holds true for power armor. So I would say that a majority of rounds that hit power armor are bouncing off of it, or rather, are spending their energy without managing to penetrate. A non-penetration or a partial penetration on a majority of the surfaces. Most materials are not simply going to bounce off or deal no damage to the armor, while in some locations and with some weapons they will certainly deal next to no damage. Now, irreplaceable, this really has become more and more of an issue as we go further into the lore. By the rules of what we thought about in 30K and what the Marines really had going logistics-wise at that period, it was assumed that power armor could simply be produced on Forge Worlds, and while that is still the case, there has arisen this cult, or rather concept, that power armor in itself is some sort of irreplaceable relic, or that it takes an incredible amount of time to craft a personal set of power armor. And while this may be true to a degree, it certainly takes a long time, it is not as if power armor is going away anytime soon, or if, suits are so aged that they cannot be mothballed and replaced with more updated versions. Marks of armor continue to be made well after the Horus Heresy and into the modern day, of course. So to say that this personal protection is totally irreplaceable is simply illogical. Difficult to replace, for sure. Definitely usually more economical to repair the armor than to do a full replacement, but it is in no way irreplaceable, and I argue that this goes for both the Chaos Space Marines and the Loyalist Space Marines. We have seen Chaos Space Marines increase in number over time, which means that the number of armor sets that they had originally must be far exhausted at this point, and they must be either taking them from Dead Astartes in order to suit new warriors, or they are more likely than not producing their own variants within the Eye of Terror, which is a horrifying thought, but is also quite plausible considering the existence of the Dark Mechanicum. So, definitely not irreplaceable. And finally, the wonder materials that Space Marine power armor is made out of. I have heard any number of claims about ceramite, about adamantium, about all these different materials from which the armor is made. I would like to put down two things that the armor is generally made out of in terms of its protection. The first one is ceramite. Ceramite, at least on the Space Marine power armor, is remarkably thick, up to 1 to 3 inches thick depending on the armor piece. For example, the shoulders and chest are almost 3 inches thick of ceramite covering backed with steel. All of these areas on the Space Marine that are painted are generally made of ceramite. That is kind of the delineation between metallic sections and ceramite sections. Now, ceramite this thick is very resistant to thermal weaponry. It is quite likely that it can resist a large number of energy-based weapons, not to mention fire and other thermally, damaging materials. However, as we have discussed before, ceramite does have several weaknesses. While it is lighter than steel, granted, a large portion of the armor is also made of steel, so it's not as if the armor is light, it is very heavy, but instead of being, impossibly heavy, as if the whole thing were made of steel, ceramite allows it to actually be more mobile, especially with the Marine using it and having an internal power system. But remember, important thing, steel is one thing, ceramite is another. So when we talk about this thing's protection and the relative protection and weak points, the ceramite will be considered, and we will see what weapons do best against it, because, as mentioned, ceramite offers wonderful thermal protection from laser weapons, from plasma weapons, to a degree from melta or other high-gain weapons. Again, plasma and melta, I'll be getting to them, but they are probably more effective than a las gun, for sure. And they certainly are effective against power armor, but they're not as effective as they might be if the power armor was made of pure steel. Survivable for the Marine in some cases rather than an outright death sentence like with most armor. But also there are steel sections, so we will go over those. Again, ceramite can crack. It is slightly less ductile than plasteel or armor steel. It can shatter, it can crack, it breaks and deforms much like steel does. There's kind of a in-between point where it can crater and shatter and put off dust. Often is the case that it draws dust from the armor because it is a ceramic material, so of course it is a condensed, aggregate, and it's probably fired and heated, so it is a mix of kind of metals, ceramics, into a material that can be both shaped while having a strong kinetic initial resistance, and then being durable enough so that it won't shatter outright like normal ceramic will. So it is more resistant than normal ceramic to shattering, but it is less resistant than steel, which would deform rather than shatter, most likely. So just remember that. On the case of the Wonder material, ceramite has its downsides and its upsides. The realities of power armor. So, Marines versus others. This is the kind of three stages of the Marine. He's got his ports, and in my opinion, usually power armor will have a subdermal material that assists with the connection with the Black Carapace. There are differences in the lore on this. Some lore, the older lore, used to say that Black Carapace was embedded into the Marine's flesh, kind of grafted into his skin, and that it was part of him. It could not be removed. It was like an implant, and that's what the ports were attached to. But increasingly, I'm seeing that this external skeleton, this kind of thick, woven steel material, these fibers that are now being called the Black Carapace, those kind of interact together and they've just become the definition of what Black Carapace is. And then, of course, over that are the various plates of armor. In general, the second Black Carapace, or the outer skin, or what I call like the underskin, or the flexible suit beneath the armor, has steel sections that are used to essentially bolt or affix the armor onto the Marine. So, in general, it goes from unprotected with all of his augmetics and ports visible so that he can attach the armor to them. Then he has this underbody glove, which is made of thick tensile steel fibers, along with a whole bunch of wires that essentially attach him to his armor beyond the kind of link that he has with it, which again is just felt through this black fleshy material. Kind of works like a second skin, also provides protection. Because the stuff is made of metal, so it is actually pretty protective, just in and of itself. And then the actual armor. So, the armor set for the Marine generally goes like this. Helmet, backpack. The backpack is a tiny little miniature nuclearized power plant, literally like a reactor on their back. Provides pretty consistent energy for a long time. It can run out, but it can also run on like low power mode, and the Marine can turn it off and kind of lope around with the armor. The armor is very heavy with or without the power pack, but without the power pack, it becomes incredibly difficult for the Marine to move around because he's essentially lugging around all of this armor by his own strength, and the reactor is heavy by itself. So helmet, reactor. A lot of armor has a gorget, which is that kind of raised section beneath the throat. Then a breastplate, a belly plate, or gut plate. It's not present on all armor, but it is a little bit of an extension on some pieces. Then he has a shoulder piece and his pauldron. The pauldrons are extra wide for reasons that we'll go over later, but they're essentially, they affect the way that a Marine fights because they can use it to protect their head, and as kind of mobile cover when they're in a firing stance. Then they have a thin ceramite slab underneath that, and two gauntlets, a groin protector, kind of like a satchel covering for their waist and hips. Not necessarily is this always armored. Sometimes it's just metal. Sometimes it's like plates of ceramite, but they're relatively thin. Then thigh plates, a knee joint plate. Sometimes it goes around the back, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the armor. And then he'll have two greave style calf plates and armored boots. So head to toe, pretty armored, but we can already see here a couple of weak points, right? So we know that the ceramite is particularly thick in three big places. The shoulders, obviously, they're intentionally made to resist weapons that the rest of the armor pretty much can't, because they're designed to protect the Marine from things that, would kill him if they hit him in the head, so he can hunch down behind them or use them to turn blows, and effectively use them as an extra layer of protection from his vital organs. Now, the thickest part of the armor is probably going right through the shoulder plate and into the breastplate. There are very few weapons that are going to get through that. Point-blank melta-shots and overcharged plasma are probably your best pick. Las cannon might do it, probably would kill the Marine, but that would be a very hard shot to line up. Uh, and maybe a couple other weapons could, but for the most part, Melta, Plasma would probably go through that trio, because the breastplate is also double thick. So if the rest of the armor is around 1 inch of ceramite, the chest plate is probably like 3, and the shoulder plates are also probably 2, and then another 1 underneath. So around 3 inches of ceramite, that might not sound like a lot, but really I think it's what's reasonable considering the Marine's size and how much armor he's carrying around. And remember, 3 inches of armor is very thick. Most infantry weapons are going to downright not go through that. And even with an inch of armor, he's pretty much protected from any weapons unless they can crack through that armor. However, you can see that he already has some weak spots. And I know I'm ignoring the text for now, but I just want to go over this now so that I can go through it in other slides. He has weak spots already that you can see. But we have to remember what's underneath that. This black carapace, the second layer, the second skin. When I say that this stuff is the equivalent of, like, thick flak armor, so it's kind of the equivalent of light carapace by itself, it's a little bit weaker because it's not designed for that, and it definitely has a chance to shred itself apart if it takes damage, because it is a bunch of microfiber wires essentially tensing and moving with the Marine, either using electricity or spring power or whatever technology you want to claim that it is. Whatever that is, if it gets hit by something and those intertwined metal pieces begin to unravel, they have a very good chance of actually ripping themselves apart, and one of these kind of bands just kind of popping or splitting. So minor damage to that can actually not necessarily hurt the Marine, but it can, lessen his ability to use his armor. It's probably needs a lot more repair, honestly, than the armor might. But remember that this is the underlayer, so you're not just shooting the Marine if you hit a weak spot, you're shooting this black underlayer through what is likely a thin protective layer on top. So I would argue that this is still on par with light carapace, even with the weakness that I described earlier with the shredding issue. And of course you can see that its hard points are just solid steel. So hitting those with anything that's like a low caliber weapon, it's probably not going to do a ton of damage, but it can still do damage. So let's talk about weak spots. Things that are going to hit that black carapace through the armor. Obviously you can already see one right up here. His eyes. Now, the sides of the Space Marine's head and the top and the back of his head are still an inch of armor, or a little bit more. But he has a lot of portions of this helmet that are made of metal and not necessarily full ceramite. So, theoretically, his ear ports, parts of his facial mask, if he has kind of wire rigs or other types of hookups to his Vox grill, they could be a weakness. They could also just be an annoyance, because wiring is run both outside and inside of the mask of the helmet. Shattering these connections, damaging them, burning them, could still interact negatively with his ability to use his suit, or speak, or communicate, anything like that. The eyes, obviously, the eyes on power armor are double layered. The outside is a very thick, bullet-resistant glass material, and the interior is almost a thick outlay. So if you imagine what a HUD looks like from the backside, it's very close to that. So the eye lenses, beyond being lit, and they are backlit, of course, because the Marine's eyes need to be glowing, but that outer layer is kind of a resistant layer. It's meant to protect him from shrapnel. It's meant to protect him from, dust or stuff getting thrown at him from essentially from things that could scratch his eye lenses and keep them from being able to let him see. The backside is pretty much just thick bulletproof glass. Anyone who's seen somebody shoot bulletproof glass, that doesn't actually make it bulletproof. It just makes it so that it will resist it. And because it's not very thick, it's probably not going to stop much. Now, if you can get that outer layer, if you get something strong enough to penetrate that outer layer, you could absolutely shoot the Marine in the eye. I would recommend for this something in the range of like a high caliber anti-materiel rifle. But if you are at like point blank range and you have like a stub pistol or a heavy revolver or something, putting it to his eye and pulling the trigger twice is a pretty solid way of killing the Marine. I'm not going to say it's a guarantee, and it would definitely be like you and 12 friends trying to dogpile this dude while you grab his head and try and shoot him in the eye hole, but it's not impossible. The other thing is that the outer layer is almost sacrificial. Because if a random las shot or a random, piece of shrapnel or something hits that outer layer, it can shatter and it won't hurt the Marine, nor will it actually damage his ability to operate because there is that internal layer. It's like a two-layer system to protect him from getting a lot of damage to his eyes. But still, random shots to the eye, if he's getting absolutely hosed down with automatic fire, a bullet that goes into his eye lens might kill him. A las bolt probably won't. You're probably going to need a second, maybe a third one to go through. But it is possible, and of course shooting a Marine in the head and making sure that it actually hits his head is a pretty effective way of putting them down, and it's way faster than trying to kill them via their vital organs or via blood loss, which, by the way, I have no idea where this came. Marines can die of blood loss. I don't know where this idea that they're just straight up immune to blood loss came from. I've heard it occasionally from people saying that, they'll never bleed out no matter what you do. I think it's more realistic to say that it would take them way longer than a normal human would to bleed out, and they won't suffer as many of the negative consequences of beginning to bleed out. Because their coagulation is so quick and their healing is relatively swift, you need to deal a very serious amount of damage and keep the Marine moving so that he keeps tearing open his wounds in order for it to begin to bleed him out. The other thing is, the Marine does make blood at, regular intervals. It's not infinite. He can run out. He can be bled out more than he can create blood. So, absolutely, you can damage a Marine and wound a Marine enough to the point where they bleed out. Maybe not into death, but definitely into incapacitation. We know this. There are great examples of this, of Marines who are wounded and captured, because they essentially blacked out from pain, shock, unconsciousness, and blood loss, altogether. But the thing is, they can come back from that. A human would probably not survive that shock, but a Marine can. So, if you get them to slow down because of blood loss, just make sure you kill them. That's all I'm going to say. Make sure they're dead, unless you really want them alive for some reason. So, sorry. Going back to the weak points. The eyes, these external sections of the helmet itself, obviously, if you have an armor-piercing weapon, go ahead. Hitting the head of a Marine in combat is going to be hard, but if you have the drop on them, or if you're firing full auto with as much power as you possibly can, there's a higher chance that you get lucky. It really is a lot of you might get lucky, or if you're persistent enough, you'll get through. The power pack, now this is a kind of a difficult part. A lot of the reactor is made of metal. However, it is very heavy and very thick, and a lot of the coverings for kind of the sensitive parts are ceramite. And even the kind of balls, the ports for the exhaust, are pretty much covered in ceramite. So, damaging the reactor isn't a terrible idea, but you would definitely need a high-caliber weapon. Something even bigger than a anti-material rifle. A bolter might do the trick, but it's not a guarantee. Like I said, the bolt gun, it has difficulty with overcoming power armor. It has to hit very straight on. It has to burrow into weak spots if you want to kill the Marine. But, big but, it doesn't have to do that as much if you're trying to hit the reactor. And of course, as we've talked about, hitting the reactor will dramatically slow down the Marine's performance. Won't stop him. Definitely won't stop him. He'll still be mad. But it'll be a lot harder for him to maneuver and run around. And also, it limits his operational capacity because the power in the armor is what keeps a lot of its systems, like its auto senses, and its hermetic sealing and stuff, and of course its muscle maneuvering, going. So without that, the Marine is handicapped, essentially. So bolt guns, autocannons are pretty effective at this. They'd have to be of a higher caliber than, like, I would say 23, 25, and they'd probably want to be firing some sort of armor-penetrating rounds. But unlike the Marine, you don't need it to do a ton of secondary damage in order to essentially turn the reactor off. You just have to make it damage that machinery. Getting behind the Marine, that's a secondary issue. We could worry about that when we come to it. But just in terms of damaging, autocannons are a good bet. Bolters are a secondary good option. Hell guns, we'll talk about them in a bit. Let's move on. from like the top half of him. I know, like I said, I thought this was going to be a short video. Apparently not. We're going to keep going. So, the throat. Now, I've already gone over the Vox Grill to a bit. It is metal, but it is metal with, similar to the eyes, it's got a sacrificial exterior, mechanics, and then a protected interior. So, when I say sacrificial exterior, the bars or the, slats that are on the outside of the Vox Grill, in this case it's the Mark V's angry, screaming Vox Grill. Actually, I don't know if this is Mark V because he's got the, errant gut plate. Doesn't matter. I'll worry about them when we get the patterns. But he's got the angry, screaming Vox Grill. This grate is made of steel, which, normally makes it look like a weak point, and it kind of is. But it's made of steel. It covers most of the marine, so it isn't like there's open slots. You could possibly stab something in there, but you'd have to force apart the metal. And behind it is the actual mechanics of the Vox. So he basically has a big, radio processor in there that takes his voice from the inside of the helmet and amplifies it to the exterior, because the Marine's armor is designed to be pretty much void-proof, with a few seconds of preparation and some shutting down of armor systems. But that machinery is still in the way of you getting to his face, mouth, and neck. And then behind that is another thin steel plate. And this is literally going to be part of his HUD, his heads-up display. So it's going to be almost touching his face. So this secondary piece, what would be his Vox receiver going out to the Vox caster, would be right in front of his face, and that's what's protected with another thin layer of steel. And that layer of steel attaches directly to his throat. So going through the face of the Marine, going through the Vox Grill, isn't a terrible idea, but you still have to penetrate the equivalent of 10-ish, or 2 slats of maybe 10 to 15 to 20 millimeters of steel. So it's not easy, but ripping the Vox Grill open is kind of the first step. And of course, if you can hit it with any type of high-caliber weapon, autocannons, bolt guns, anything of that nature, even hell weapons. Actually, I kind of recommend hell weapons because they can penetrate through the metal more easily than they can the ceramite. So hell weapons, that kind of stuff, anything that through the metal, through the grill of the Vox caster is great, because not only is it, weaker than the rest of the armor, it's on the helmet still, which means that you're going to be hitting his mouth, his face, his jaw. You might get into the higher level of his throat, if you can close the throat via heat, or if you can, have a round go through there and fill his face full of shrapnel. That's not only going to really annoy him and, make him bleed from possibly heavy arteries, it's also going to shatter a whole bunch of his heads-up display, making him rely on, backup systems like his eye lenses that are giving him all his auspex might break. His Vox is obviously going to break. His radio communications might be damaged. This is important because, like I'll say a whole bunch of times in this video, and I've said in previous videos, it isn't the job of the individual to kill the Space Marine. That's not the job. The job is for the individual to do their absolute damnedest to wound, injure, or slow that son of a bitch down so that the next squad with the next group of weapons can enact the same plan, and maybe they'll take him down. That's the whole idea. When we're talking about vulnerability, it's not vulnerability of killing. It's rare that you get a chance to just outright kill a Space Marine because, well, their whole purpose is to not get killed in one shot, generally. But wounding, taking off capabilities, removing abilities of the armor to continue fighting, that's how you get rid of Space Marines. Breaking down their fancy, coherent systems to ensure that the advantages that they have can get canceled out, and if you weaken them enough, they will either break off because they need time to rest and recover and fix themselves, or B, you'll catch them in an unlucky second. Every unlucky chance that you can get to fire at Marines is a great chance, because any unlucky second, any bad turn, any poor decision, any moment of weakness that you can get out of a Marine is a golden opportunity to put him down. Alright, continuing on. The elbows. Now, I like to go over the fact that the kind of greaves and the calf plate, the greave, and the gauntlet are all a little bit thicker than the thigh plates. Some of that is partially optical illusion. Of course, it has to be bigger because it has to cover the entirety of the Marine's calf. in addition to his, armored boot, so it's got to cover the whole thing, which means it's just a little bit roomier. But there's also a bunch of servos and stuff in here, so it's kind of illusory how thick this is. It's still that kind of 1.5 inch thick armor that covers everything except the breastplate and the shoulder pads. But it's bigger because it's got a whole bunch of mechanical stuff in it that assists him in running, lifting, moving stuff with his hands, all of that kind of stuff. But there are weak points here. 2 of them, in fact, on his arms. One is the inside of the elbow. Now, if you look over here, that's got a steel plate here, and obviously it's got servos and that kind of black metal false muscle underneath it. That doesn't mean it's not a vulnerability still. When a Marine is in a combat stance, melee or ranged, he's going to be constantly opening and closing his arms, whether it's to reload his weapon, change his point of aim, change the hand that he's firing with, or fight in melee. He's always going to be opening his elbows and closing his elbows, lifting things, moving stuff out of the way, giving hand signals to his brothers, whatever it might be that he's doing, glorifying the Emperor with a hand in the air. Perfectly good example to shoot him in the elbow. And I'm not even saying that you have to shoot him. One of the good options is that when you're fighting a Marine as a Marine, you'd want to swing for areas that are going to be joints. Elbows are a great option because if it's a melee fight and you both have chainswords, for example, if you can immobilize an arm for a second and dig your chainsword into that aperture, you can rip through that material pretty quickly and begin to grind into flesh. If you're pretty strong, you can hold it there for a second and try and cut his arm off. Not a high chance of that. There's a lot of metal holding it in. Astartes bone, flesh is relatively tough, but it's not impossible, and it's definitely not unheard of for a Marine to lose their arm below the elbow. Matter of fact, that's why there's a lot of augmetics that are just for elbow down of Space Marines. This is a weak spot that gets utilized a lot. Second weak spot, and this is the one that I repeat over and over and over again. You've heard it before. Fingers and hands. All of these little articulated pieces, they have little pieces of metal, and behind them is a small patch of ceramite. The underside of the Marine's hands is almost entirely protected by the black carapace, while his fingertips have little ceramite bits. They're also heavily mechanical on the underside. They got stuff like magnets, they have kind of auspex and feely bits that let them feel tactile stuff. All of these are systems that you can damage, and more importantly, they are weak spots in the armor that are going to be exposed during combat. You might say, hitting a Marine in the hands is impossible. They're going to be fighting all the time. They move like a blur. Another thing, Marines absolutely do not move in a blur. I really, really hate this myth because it is genuinely just authors taking full-on license. Marines are huge. They're bulky. The armor is heavy. They are fast. Yes. They are quick. Yes. They are strong. Yes. To move at a blur, they have to be absolutely sprinting, and you cannot fight while sprinting. Again, people draw this comparison to, well, a Marine can run at 60 kilometers an hour. Yes, if they literally put all of their effort into it and go in one direction as hard pelt as they possibly can, they can run like a freight train. Yes, they can. That takes a really long time to work up to, and it's not like they're fighting at that speed. They're not going around and popping off shots at 60 kilometers an hour. They are sprinting essentially cross-country. The example where that's taken from is essentially a Marine group sprinting cross-planet to another war zone. And they're like, well, we don't have transport right now. Gotta hoof it, essentially. And they're running like freight trains. At that speed, you are not fighting. So to say that a Marine is a blur while fighting, their weapons might be, certainly they are strong. If you're in melee and you're kind of like, oh my god, this 8-foot-tall monster is standing in front of me, it might look like a blur. But believe me, as with anything that's moving fast, if you take a few steps back and you focus, it's not a blur. They're clearly standing there. You can see the armor. You can see the protection. And of course, in order to get effective, accurate fire, like any other soldier, Marines have to stop moving. I'm not saying stop moving entirely. I'm not saying stop moving for long. But they have to take a second, draw a bead, and fire. In that moment, that little golden opportunity second, look at the hands. Where are they? One is going to be underneath the handle of their bolter. The other one is going to be on the trigger pack. Shoot the hands with anything that you have that can penetrate ceramite. Just shoot the hands. If you blow off a finger, Even if it's a pinky finger, even if it's something like that, it's going to be twisted, it's going to be bleeding, there's a lot of digits in there, it's going to heal incorrectly. This is the other thing. People claim that Marines have such a great healing factor. I agree, they do. They have a great healing factor. If you've ever heard of the issues with healing factor in debilitating injuries, you can have bones grow back wrong. You can have flesh go where it doesn't need to go. And you might be like, well, it's fixable. He can just twist it into place. You're in power armor. If you twist a broken finger into place, you're liable to rip it off. And this goes for other things like broken bones, like a broken thigh bone. A Marine's just gonna fix that, of course. If you try and set a thigh bone in power armor, or even if you took it off and tried to set it yourself, that is agonizing, and the chance that you clip a major artery and you theoretically exsanguinate yourself and start bleeding out inside your armor is pretty high. They are smart, they're capable, but it's definitely something that you would rather, wait and try and get somebody to rescue you before you try and set a massive broken bone like that. And the other thing is, people also claim that because of the healing factor, well, it just fixes itself. It could fix itself wrong. And you really don't want to have to deal with, like, bone spurs ripping through your flesh all the time. Or with, blood blisters and stuff kind of forming inside of your armor. Because the Marine's blood coagulates so strongly and so quickly, you could theoretically have, like, a blood bruise that starts building up on a wounded area. And might even significantly impact your ability to use your armor. We've seen many times that Marines bleed through their armor. So they'll take an injury... they'll continue to fight, they'll rip it open again and again and again, and it'll keep bleeding over and over and over again, and this kind of welt will raise of drying blood on their side, or on an arm or a limb, and it will either interfere with the movement of the armor, this tight black carapace material can get interfered with by the amount of drying blood, or it can actually cause them to bleed out, or, suffer some degradation from that. The other thing is, theoretically, if you're bleeding a whole bunch everywhere, it gives off a lot of easy tracking hints. Falling a wounded Marine is probably something that Chaos Cultists or enemy Marines would love to do, because wounded Marines are weaker Marines with more vulnerabilities. So, when I say that, I mean, shoot the hands. Go for things that you wouldn't expect, and remember, Marines are soldiers. They can die. They do die all the darn time, fighting all kinds of things. Moving on to the last couple here, the entire midsection I look at as one big weak spot. Yeah, you might ask why. There's a lot of armor, there's a lot of protection. There are 3 of these big tubes, and these are partially power, partially other materials, breathing, reservoir, all that kind of stuff. They're external, so they're obviously like backup systems. And then there is this black pleated material. I usually point this out as, in most of the armor, it's just steel. It's just steel protection over this midsection. It's used so that they can twist, so that they can move more easily. And it gives you a lot of weak points. These little plated sections, the waistband, essentially, of their girdle, is, the Marine jockstrap, if you will. It is thinner than the rest of the armor. It's flexible, which means that there's joints that you can hit. And it is in one of the most vulnerable places. So, if you've ever heard of a hip bull shot or a hip shot, it is very difficult to stay standing up if you get hit anywhere between, like, your navel and the bottom of your hips. Because your hips are kind of all one piece, if you get damage to that bone cluster, your legs will very much have a hard time staying up. And it has a very consistent way of putting people down, and there's nothing about the Marine physiology that prevents this from being an issue they have. The second thing is, this section is obviously less protected than the rest of their body. It's got no ceramite, or if it does have ceramite in some of the versions we'll talk about it, it's thinner. And it's designed to move and shift, which could cause it to be at awkward angles. Again, if I were equipped with an autogun, I probably wouldn't be fighting with a Marine, but if I had any choice in the matter, I would go for this undercarriage area, and try and stab him with a bayonet or shoot him with that there. Or, the other thing I mentioned was, I would go underneath his arms. Marines are often, taller than you, they're bigger, they're raising their arms to fire their bolt gun, or to hail on their enemies, or to swing their chainsword. If you can jam a bayonet underneath their arm, because, of course, there's no armor underneath there, obviously there's armor that goes onto the underside of the bicep, but in the actual armpit, and on the side of the breastplate, there is a section
where there must needs be a connection. So this area here, this kind of bracket, that's exactly where you want to aim. Right in the pit of their armpit, essentially stab or shoot, and then hold on to the trigger if you're impaled there, and just hopefully you get to the heart, the shoulder. There's a lot of, there's not much lethal damage that you can do here, but if you shatter the clavicle, break his shoulder with a bullet or something, that's an arm gone. And a Marine who's down one arm is still fighting you, but now you're gonna want to start charging him with a little bit more vim and vigor, because he's now vulnerable. He's got one less arm with which to kill you. But, if it takes the sacrifice of one person to disable an Astartes arm, that is a great trade. That is a good deal. I think anyone would make that deal. So, underarms, good. Waist, great. I think the waist is one of the biggest weak points in the armor. Really just most consistent among all patterns. It's the weak spot. Groin, same thing. You're obviously just going to have to get a little bit more power here, and you want to try and not clip the thigh pads. Behind the knee has the same rule as the elbow joint. It's a weak spot. Aim for it in melee. Aim for it if you get the drop on them. Blowing their knee out is a great idea because, again, anything that can hamper their mobility, because they are quite fast and because they are quite mobile and they're good at getting into cover and, protecting themselves and also running at you with a chainsword and chopping you into little pieces, blowing a knee out, damaging their leg is a great plan. And, unlike a single arm break or some sort of long bone that they can set and fix possibly inside their armor, even if they're willing to risk, bone spurs or damage to them, you're not going to be fixing your knee joint in a couple of minutes. That might take hours and or an apothecary to fix. So knee joints, major joints like that, shoulder joints, and ankle joint, even though the ankle of the Marine is weirdly enough better protected than the knee joint. The feet and legs is pretty much a no-go zone. Even with the boots, there's really so much thickness here, and there's no lethal way to hurt this area. Unless you have landmines or something like that, I wouldn't chance it. So just to go over the weak spots again, we have back of the knees, groin, waist, elbows, hands, under armor, armpit, throat, vox grill, side of the helmet, power pack, and the eye lenses. So, not looking so invulnerable now, is it? I know, I'm being a little bit facetious, but still, my point is clear. So, let's now go over the realities of the power armor, because I've just been waiting to get that off my chest for, unironically, probably a year or more. Marines versus others. Marines have very standardized armor sets. They work to protect the whole body, but they also work in a lot of cases to enhance their physical ability. Now with Marines, this is a very symbiotic process. What do I mean by symbiotic? I mean the Marine assists the armor, and the armor assists the Marine. The Marine is able to use the armor to his best protection. He knows his weak spots. He's well aware that he's not invulnerable, and he knows darn well that he can use this armor incorrectly, and he knows to not do that, essentially. And the armor, on the other hand, gives him strength. It gives him auto-injectors for drugs and medicines. It gives him power, gives him that thick, woven extra strength. Gives him the servos in his hands and in his legs to move around and have extra strength to push, pull, or move things. It's very much like a mechanized, almost like a miniaturized mech in how strong the armor can be. But these aren't everywhere. They don't cover the whole body. It really is the legs, because, of course, Marines need to run long distances in theory. They can't just be stymied by distance. And the shoulders, back, and arms. So these aren't as strong, the ones on the shoulders, back, and arms, but they are still powerful. The ones on the legs really are the powerhouse ones that almost give them like vehicle level of striding capability, jumping and lifting. The reactor can, provide some of this strength because it powers the Black Carapace to a lower degree, but still, that's where we go into the difference between Marines and others. Marines have that give and take. For others, they rely on the power armor a lot more. So if you're wearing power armor and you're not an Adeptus Astartes, you're probably wearing it to make up for the fact that you yourself are not all that physically imposing compared to the enemies of the Imperium. Now, Inquisitors use this a lot. Some followers of Chaos use it. There are multiple demagogues from the Sabbat Worlds Crusade who are described as wearing powered armor or power suits of armor. There's proto-power armor, there's Xenos power armor, but a majority of the ones who use it are humans. For humans, it works a lot more like a battle mech. For humans, power armor as opposed to powered armor being like what Scion's heavy carapace is. It's that one step right between like light power armor and heavy carapace. That Scion middle ground. For humans, the jump from Scion to power armor is about the same level of difficulty as standard Marines power armor jump to Terminator armor. So Terminator armor is a lot harder to control. It requires specialty training. You could hurt yourself or others by using it. If you're untrained in Marine power armor, you're big and bulky, and there's a chance that it won't hurt you all that much, even though you could still accidentally hurt your friends. Terminator armor, it has a chance to break your bones. It can rip, limbs from the socket. A lot of its mechanics are so strong and so like twitchy in terms of their strength level, or in terms of their like false muscle, that they can theoretically injure and or severely wound a Marine if he's not well trained in how to use it. So similar thing with humans using powered armor. So they need training, it needs practice. It will never be as smooth for a human to interact with power armor as it will be for a Marine. It kind of has that clunky, mech-like feeling of a Space Marine being in Terminator armor. You feel kind of restricted. Yeah, you're really protected, but the weapons and equipment you're using kind of feel like you're using them with false hands. Not so for Marines in genuine, like, base-level power armor. It feels like an armored second skin to them. It is a little bit more awkward than just being out of their skin, but they're trained so often with it, and they have so much in psycho-indoctrination to use it, that it really does feel about as comfortable to them as, regular body armor would to a human. So that's the big difference, is that Marines have a symbiotic relationship with power armor, standard power armor. Again, they have issues with Terminator armor the same way that humans have an issue with power armor. But for humans, their connection with power armor is much more stilted. Can come off as awkward, uncomfortable, maybe even a little bit distressing, to be in this literal armored coffin. But there's lighter versions of power armor that feel a lot less annoying, and quite often, since power armor and human pattern Terminator armor, which we will talk about when we go through Terminator armor, which is the next video, that is a thing that exists, it's often worth the protection for humans to be a little bit uncomfortable. Vulnerabilities and materials, we just went over that in extensia, I apologize. Exosuit and armor suit, as mentioned, the kind of servos and the false muscle that comes along with this make it kind of both exosuit, so it's a mechanical suit that assists in movement and the resistance of, pressure and damage and all that stuff. Recoil and impacts and stuff are all dampened by it like an exosuit, but then it has this extra layer. And when I say layer, I literally mean like grafted on or bolted on protection of the ceramite overcoat. The kind of thick 3 to 1 inch material settings that cover the rest of the Marine. Now, complexity of training and manufacture. Obviously, for Marines, it's mostly handled via psycho-indoctrination and extensive training. It takes years for them to be up to the good standards with this stuff. It is very difficult to use. All of the subsystems are very complicated. Maintenance and repair on the armor can be complicated. We'll talk about that in a bit. And of course, manufacturing power armor, while not impossible, we've been over like forges can produce this stuff. It's kind of just considered like a mastercrafted thing. Like, they're not churning out suits upon suits of power armor. Unless you want to talk about certain lore that has existed recently, where they churned out thousands of sets of power armor in weeks. I'm being a little facetious and a little bit mean, but still, the general assumption is that power armor is a real passion for certain tech priests. They kind of set up on Forge Worlds, and they have an existing power armor pattern. Obviously most patterns are like partially STC and partially design. Or in the terms of power armor, it's usually like the power pack and parts of the helmet are the STC part of the design. That's the standard the standard template design, and then you surround that with a set of armor, and that's what makes a pattern of power armor. We see this in the Heresy, when there are, tech priests going around following the Legion. They're like, oh, we found this proto-human civilization with the ability to make powered combat suits. And then, lo and behold, the Adeptus Mechanicus go down, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, this society, they had a broken piece of an STC that made X piece of power armor. Boom, that's a new pattern now." That was how it generally worked back in the day. I've seen no evidence to the contrary. I mean, a lot of power armor is just developed as improvements of previous marks, and we'll go over that when we go into marks and patterns in a bit. So, constant replacement and maintenance. Power armor obviously has a lot of subsystems, obviously has a lot of electronics, and it goes through a beating. It gets beaten on like nobody's business, whether it's, crazy cultists running around with sledgehammers trying to smash you in the face, or crack limbs off, or break pieces of your armor, giant mutants, or demons, or Chaos Space Marines, or even like Eldar and Orcs and all their nasty stuff that's cutting into your ceramite and chopping you to pieces. You're gonna need replacements. Now, with the armor that is, majority worn by Marines, it is replaced piecemeal. They will have sections or sets. Some of the really well-equipped Marine legions used to have multiple sets of armor. So they'd have at least two. For the higher ranking, the first company would always have their set of armor and then maybe a second one. Maybe a Terminator set, maybe an older Mark that they use as a backup, that kind of stuff. And I could definitely see Marines, even Chaos Marines, having this. So we have an example, Sevatar has his Terminator suit, and then he has his Master Crafted set. He prefers the Master Crafted set, honestly. But we also see this with other Marines where they will kill someone and take their armor but not use it. It's a backup. With Loyalists, this is not always the case, especially if you're a smaller chapter, especially if you're Fleetborn. They might have issues with maintaining multiple sets of armor for every Marine. And for the larger chapters, like the Black Templars, for example, they're going through suits of armor at a pretty consistent rate, and they don't follow the rules that limit the number of Astartes in a chapter. So I could see them, they are very wealthy because they constantly go on campaign and they have some incredible accolades. So it's not like a Forge World is going to tell them to get stuffed, but at the same time, they're providing more suits of armor and then losing subsequently more suits of armor than almost any other chapter will at one time. So there's probably a pretty consistent order out from the Adeptus Mechanicus. If you have any extras, throw them at the Eternal Crusade. They'll pay good money. That kind of stuff. Maintenance. Other than just, getting it replaced, popping off a piece of armor and saying, "Get me a shoulder pad, Surf, from whatever backup set or whatever extra pieces we have." There's also something called Ceramite Patch Repair, which is one of my absolute favorite 40k concepts because it's such a mundane idea. It is, oh no, a bullet or a hellgun blast or something has dug a 2-inch divot in my armor, and it's, down to the lowest bit, and I don't want to have a weak spot in my armor. Surf, come grab me this little tube of, essentially liquid ceramite and spread it around in this injury and then take a little patch and put it on. It's almost like patching an old intertube tire where they have a liquid material and then they cap it with either steel to let it set or they cap it with some other type of material. And it just makes this hilarious image of a Marine running around with a whole bunch of like quilted patches in his armor. I find that absolutely hilarious. I don't know if you do, but man, that is funny. Just the idea of a Marine running around in his, ultimate suit of finery and protection, and he's got like a little boo-boo or a little bandage basically put over a broken piece of armor. Exception for Chaos. Now, Chaos doesn't have the logistics that the Imperium does. They will steal, borrow, beg, and kill to get power armor and power armor bits, but the maintenance of power armor is really something that a lot of warbands don't care about. And this is one of the things when I come to comparing like for like, comparing Loyalist Astartes who are very well-trimmed, they're well-maintained, they have equipment, they have replacements, to warbands that might be completely falling apart, that might be kind of without supply. They've made enemies of the Dark Mechanicum, they've made enemies of the Iron Warriors, they can't support themselves, they don't have any Tech Marines, so they're kind of just walking around in what they have. This will really exude itself in warbands that don't have a lot of Chaos Alliance, because the more Chaos Aligned legions not only have more pull with those societies, because, they're blessed of the gods, but also the really big thing is a lot of Chaos Space Marines don't need to maintain their armor as much. Now you might say, well, they rules of physics. If the Space Marines have to take care of their armor, why don't the Chaos Space Marines? My point would be Plague Marines, genuine Plague Marines, not followers of Nurgle who are also, green. But the real Death Guard, I don't think the Death Guard need to repair their armor, guys. It's cracked and there's a giant mouth gaping out of it. I don't think he's concerned about daubing some ceramite patch repair on the armor. The Emperor's Children are another great example. I bet you the Emperor's Children probably take fastidious care of their power armor. But technically, they probably don't have to. A lot of it is mixed with their flesh. It's combined, possessed from the Wordbearer's Legion. Their armor is literally grafted to them. It works like flesh. It heals itself. It is a little bit weaker than, regular power armor, but they're also possessed by demons, so they're a little bit tougher than the average Marine as well. So when I say that some Chaos Forces will suffer from severe lack of maintenance, a lot of Night Lord warbands get like this, where it's like, well, my greave is broken and my shoulder plate is broken. Guess I'm going to have to repair those with steel, because we don't have any ceramite, and also we have no extra armor pieces. So either I gotta kill a Marine next time we fight, or I better be careful, because I am now way less protected than a Loyalist Astartes. And then you'll have, the World Eater. The World Eaters probably do need to repair their armor. I don't think Khorne gives too much of a darn about how they repair it, and he might bless them, anyway, and keep it up to standard like the Death Guard do, but definitely, if you're a non-Chaos Aligned warband, Traitor Chapter or Night Lords or some sort of Legion that doesn't have a ton of technical support, the Iron Warriors aren't straight up, dedicated to one of the gods like the Death Guard are, but they could also repair and create their own armor just fine on Mendringard. There's no problems with that. As one of my favorite things of lore is that even though it's the modern day, the Iron Warriors still choose to use one of the coolest patterns of armor ever, which is Mark III Iron, named right after him. Love it so much. Love Mark III. So yeah, that's the exceptions, and that's the maintenance issues. Finally, assumed standard and assumed substandard. This is when I get into, again, that whole thing of comparing like to like. Comparing Loyalist Astartes to Traitor Astartes, and comparing human power armor to Astartes power armor, and a Soritas power armor to either of them. Because I will talk about all of them. It is assumed that the Marine's armor is standard until you can tell that there's issues. So, one of the big things is like, well, that bolt round, it went right through that Marine's face and it killed him instantly, or I shot him like 5 times with a bolt round, with bolt guns, and it killed him. And this oftentimes was in like cinematics or in animations, because of course there's limitations to what you can portray. But the Chaos Marines are kind of seen as, their armor's weaker, it's substandard, it's just assumed to be worse. And then the Loyalist Astartes, they have the newest power armor, and that's the best thing. It's even better, more protected than these old, ancient heresy-era patterns. Now, I'm not going to come down on either side of this argument. It goes both ways. Loyalist Marines can be in combat for a long time, and they could be using crappy armor that's got a lot of broken pieces and replacements. And Chaos Forces can absolutely be in a scenario where they have no replacements and no maintenance and don't care about it, like, Khornate warbands might not give a darn about replacing their armor, even if it's falling apart and broken and doesn't work anymore. But the implied bias and the writer gap is essentially whoever is writing the story, the power armor is as protective or is not as protective as it needs to be. Now, I hate just saying writer bias or writer gap, because it sounds like a cop-out, right? But I think you can see that I'm going into this as in-depth as I possibly can, and explaining to you that under certain circumstances, you could almost claim anything about the protection level of power armor. There are weak spots, there are non-weak spots. There are scenarios where weak spots become strong spots and strong spots become weak spots. Between patterns, there are differences that can strengthen or weaken an author's claim to authenticity. And in my opinion, you really do have to think about, hold on, why was that done? How did that happen? Where did he hit him? What's the result of that? Just logic your way through it, and if it comes out to being like, no, that doesn't make any sense at all, that should have stopped it, you can kind of get in your mind like, okay, we're writing from this angle, we're writing with this author in this way. And that's okay. That's fine for reading a book. It's fine for even writing your own stories. I do write a lot of 40K stuff, whether it's, short stories, novels, RP, anything like that. You really just have to kind of figure out where we're getting biased here, figure out what the situation is, and try your best to use logic and rationalization to prevent the assumed standard or assumed substandard issue. Pros and cons of power armor. I have some lovely outlays right here. So, it's multi-part. That's great. I can replace all the little bits of this. This is one of the newest sets of armor. It's one of my favorites, but as much as GW tries to adjust the armor so that it doesn't have weak spots, it still does. Look, side of the head, eye lenses. The mouthpiece here is covered, but that's not thick ceramite. He's got joints here. He's got back of his neck. Theoretically, this pauldron could be cracked, but again, you don't want to do that. You probably want to go from above, from an angle. Underside of the arm, same thing. You can see that there's a black gap there where there's steel. Inside of the elbow. These things, it's supposed to cover the underside of the Marine's ribs. This area is still steel, so the black, or in this case the red, is also steel. Jamming through there, stabbing through there, or trying to shatter this gut plate, or shattering these rib plates. Again, these have sections and gaps in between them. They're not super deep, like you can see in here. They're just kind of shallow. But if you can hit inside of there, obviously hitting on the exterior is thicker than hitting on the interior, and if you have a melee weapon or something of that nature, it would be easier to grind through the black area. So, again, waist, groin, top of the hips, bottom of the hips, elbows, finger joints, obviously here, they're covered, but the interior of the fingers, we know, have weaker joints sometimes, and obviously damaging a finger is great. Back of the knee, as I said, no point in firing at the front of the knee. It's not really all that great. And then feet, don't bother. So, again, back of the knee, inside of the groin, waist, still waist and ribs here, and then face, head, and inside, and gauntlets. So, modern armor, more protective, definitely better, but not invulnerable by any case. This one's a little bit older. It's got the Astartes outlook, but it's kind of the same pattern. But you can kind of see here what I'm talking about when I say that it's metal and then black underneath. These metal joints here that cover the interior, these are plasteel plates. So they're definitely, protective, but you can see they don't cover everything. They don't cover sections of his ribs, parts of his arms, his chest, throat, neck, head. None of this is protected. And in this case, it has this metal underneath the ceramite. I kind of usually assume that it's all ceramite and then the steel underlay is what the black carapace is. Or there might be a very thin steel projected area. But this is really the exoskeleton that I want to highlight isn't protecting him all that much. And while there may be plates and areas here that are protected, there's sections and layers to everything that you can always find weak spots here. Plenty of flesh open to penetration once you get through the outer armor. Multi-part means you can replace it. That's definitely a pro. Highly resistant, obviously, it's great protection. It's top of the line in the Imperium. On par with almost every other equipment. There are obviously better ones in terms of like Terminator armor, Dreadnought armor, all that types of stuff that are personal. But still, highly resistant, definitely a pro. Multi-system protection. Now, this can protect you from the void. It can protect you from lots of different fields, electricity, all types of different things. And it's got fallbacks and drugs and all types of stuff to help you out, including already having bonuses for your auto senses and stuff. So it helps a lot, the multi-system protection. Enhancement packages, I kind of count this as both a pro and a con. Older Marines or kind of far off chapters or groups that might have an issue sticking around the Mechanicus, or minor chapters that don't have as much bargaining power, might be fighting at a bit of a disadvantage. If they don't have the most modern thing, they might honestly be kind of weaker than the average Astartes. I don't usually classify, not modern as weaker, because of course Chaos Astartes are doing just fine with some of the older heresy patterns. But it does create this kind of gap between what power armor could be and what power armor is in reality. And the enhancement packages range from, reasonable stuff to things that are totally unreasonable. Extra aspects, stuff that kind of gets bolted onto the armor and just kind of works as an additional thing. You see this a lot with like specialists, like snipers and things like that. They'll have big old auspecs that cover an entire eye, or augmetics that hook into their equipment. Restrictions in size, weight, and flexibility. The Marine Power Armor obviously is bigger, and while it is highly protective, it also is jointed armor, so it has limitations to its range of motion. And because it isn't moved by, or it's moved by a mix of servos and artificial muscle, it can be jerky and imprecise at times. If you're kind of not focusing, or if you're in the middle of combat and you're just kind of swinging around or like reacting really quickly, because Marines' senses are quick enough that they have very fast reaction time, this is definitely a con. Because you can jerk things out of place, you can accidentally throw stuff, you can break stuff, you can hit walls, you can damage things. You could theoretically hit a battle buddy, or even, again, this is more prevalent with Terminator armor, of injuring yourself while using your armor. But theoretically, you could hurt yourself while using the power armor. If you're not paying attention, if you're panicked, if you're freaking out, you might rip muscles out of their joints, or you might break bones if you're using them incorrectly. And of course, the Marines are heavy. They're very heavy. I think the last thing was like they're almost like a ton, or a little bit more, maybe a ton. And, you might think, well, that's not a problem. Plenty of things are heavy and they can go around and they can move themselves. It's not really an issue of can they move themselves or not, while that might be an issue for if the power armor isn't powered anymore. The real issue is, how do Marines walk in areas meant for civilians? Staircases in HABs are not designed for a 1-ton man to go sprinting up them. I could definitely see Marines getting accidentally, trapped or theoretically tricked into an area not designed to hold their weight, and they just break through the floor, or fall through a roof, or fall into some sort of trap based upon their weight. It has happened before. And the other thing is, because of that mix in their restrictions in size, weight, and the lack of flexibility, Marines can get buried. And I like to talk about this a lot because it happens to Night Lords. It happens, I believe, to Talos Valkoran. He is trapped underneath a HAB block that collapses on top of him. And he's effectively stuck. Since, he's under something too heavy for his armor to lift, and he is not able to get out of the armor and it's constantly squeezing him, he's effectively stuck and immobilized. And as a cultist or as an enemy of the Imperium, it's not an unreasonable idea to trick Marines into an area where they're able to get buried under something and then detonate that area to try and collapse them underground. They might be able to dig themselves out, but in the hour or more that it might take for them to dig themselves out of 30 feet of reinforced concrete that's fallen on top of them, you could bring up some tanks or some specialist troops to wait until they get out and then kill them. So definitely a con and another strategy for dealing with Marines there. Bonus killing Marine strategy. Maintenance or lack thereof. We already went over maintenance being an issue with some warbands and possibly with some lesser chapters. Again, that's really an edge case. There are chapters that get sanctioned. There are chapters that just have bad relations with the Mechanicus. And there are chapters that prefer to do their own thing. The Iron Hands are people. Or they're not people, they're Astartes. The Iron Hands are Astartes. They like to do it all themselves. They like to do a lot of stuff, it is of the same quality, yes. But, much like the Mechanicus, they can be deprived of resources as well. They can have issues being trapped in locations without the ability to maintain themselves. And if they don't have a ton of supply on hand, which they generally will, but if it's been a while since our last resupply, they might suffer an issue with maintenance. And lack thereof can really hamper power armor. If they don't have fuel, if they don't have repairs, if they don't have replacement, you pretty quickly get this patchwork effect where, well, I have a weak spot here, that means I need to favor the other shoulder, or I need to favor the other side of my armor. If I have a replacement knee, or if I have some sort of unpowered servo, I might have to be more conservative in how I fight. Being slower, being more conservative, being less aggressive can get Marines wounded a lot more often. It can also protect them if they're with a large other group, but if they're in smaller groups, obviously you don't want to engage huge groups of Astartes all at once, for obvious reasons. But if they're in smaller groups and they kind of are suffering consistent casualties or lack of maintenance, they'll begin to suffer attrition. Not severe attrition, not to the point where it keeps them from fighting, but to the point where more of those golden opportunities that I talked about will begin to make themselves apparent. Finally, fake armor sets and cheap inferior replacements. So I already went over the idea of, this is, again, pro and con. On one side of the thing, there are fake armor sets that work really well, whether it's like human sets that get adjusted into being a sturdy size. That's really rare, but it can happen, especially with, like, really nice mastercrafted human Terminator armor can be fitted to a Marine, probably. With a little bit of modification, I'm sure. And the same thing happens in the other side of things, where Marine power armor can get scaled down to a human size. Again, that's really difficult, and it will essentially require a full disassembly, and reassembly after cutting down a whole bunch of pieces and, replacing them with more analog sets for the human, who isn't hooked directly into the armor, but is rather controlling it, like a mech. But cheap inferior replacements is really the biggest thing, because Marines that have broken pieces of armor that they can't replace will probably go and spring for a cheap replacement. A worse, slightly worse, set of protection. And this could range from anything from just replacing something with steel that's, extra thick, to cover up the fact that the, a pauldron or piece is missing. They could replace it with steel, most certainly. But a lot of the time it will just be, our armored plate, some piece of plasteel or something like that that's been contoured, or, the other thing is grafting together pieces of plasteel plate with metal, essentially welding the plasteel, or welding the ceramite back together, isn't impossible, but like with any other, semi-metal requiring material, because of course ceramite is, a ceramic that has metallic qualities, which means it's a ceramic that includes or has inclusions of plasteel, it's going to get weaker as you continue to do this, because if you have heat-treated steel, or quote-unquote finished ceramite, where the process to make it kinetically resistant as well as thermally resistant, so it doesn't just shatter, has been completed, if you heat it back up again, you can ruin that chemical perfection like you can with forged steel or with carbonized steel. If you reheat it, you increase the brittleness, you can damage the, Brunel hardness level. All these issues can happen when you reforge ceramite or reforge steel. For this reason, a lot of that cracked armor pieces you'll see filled up with ceramite patch repair, or done over with a metal plate, so that theoretical weakness is accounted for with extra protection. And you'll see that a lot more in Chaos Warbands than you will in Loyalist chapters, but not impossible in Loyalist chapters. Definitely possible if they've been on campaign for a while. False muscle and mechanical assistance. I've already been over this. I don't like this assembly where it says that there's this enormous assister in the shoulder. Personally, I think that the servo would probably be inside of the shoulder and not on top of the... Yeah, it says like a ceramic shell with an adamantium plasteel weave. I've never really held with this idea that normal power armor has a whole bunch of adamantium in it. It might have some for the servos for resistance and toughness, but in general, I think these are purely protective, and the servos are... There's plenty of room between the Marine's shoulder and the shoulder plate, so I think this is just a little bit off. Then again, this is Mark 10 Tacitus, so who knows what it is. There's not a lot of details about that one. I don't dislike it, but it's definitely not my favorite. Alright, moving on to patterns and marks, the thing that most people are actually here for, unironically. So, who is it and what's it made of? Again, ceramite, steel, that's the main two ingredients in power armor. Who makes it? Literally just forges. It's almost always forges. The only examples where that's not the case are tech priests who are in the personal employment of the Inquisition. That's really the only exception, and even they are from Forge Worlds, where they got the design. They've just been let out to essentially maintain the Inquisitor's armor. So, what are the level of powers and protection? In general, most of the power armor that exists is highly resistant to energy weapons of, the lower gain types. Hellguns. Hellguns really are an issue because they are too weak to penetrate the ceramite because it's so resistant to energy weapons, but they are very capable of penetrating the metal sections. So the normal lasgun can penetrate these sections, but it's not going to do a lot of damage, even if it hits a couple times, because it has to melt through the armor first, through the metal. Hellguns, on the other hand, have a much higher chance of damaging the metal and penetrating through it, so while they are not capable of penetrating the armor per se, they can go through weak spots and do more damage than either autoguns or lasguns. So, not a terrible idea. For bolt guns, obviously, bolt guns can't penetrate through the thicker layers of armor. They can. They have a higher chance of cracking them, cracking the ceramite armor because it is a heavier round and it's fully kinetic. So it's not unheard of for bolt rounds to spend themselves on the armor and create a dent or a crack or a ripple, some weakness that can then be followed up on by, chasing the dragon and firing more shots. Not to mention, if you hit a marine in a weak spot with a bolt gun, including the faceplate or you don't want to hit the top of the helmet because that's one area where it is always angled and a little bit thick. So hitting the top of the helmet, hitting the upper side, not a great idea, but hitting 90 degrees on the ears, face, eye lenses, anywhere like that with the bolter is a pretty solid chance that you're going to kill or definitely injure the marine. In the weak spots, on the underarm, on the elbow, they're harder to hit with bolt weapons, but not impossible. Heavy bolters, pretty much the same thing. The only difference is the post-armor effect is even better. So, heavy bolters, definitely pretty solid. A marine's armor is going to take quite a few hits from the heavy bolter, unlike the bolter, which theoretically it can take probably, I would say, 5 to 6 hits on the same piece of heavy armor, or 3 or 4 if it's a weaker piece. So if it's a thigh, or if it's an arm or a gauntlet, it would probably take 3 direct. I'm not talking like glancing shots or like bounces. I'm talking like direct. It spends all of its energy, it leaves a dent, and it explodes. And then it gets hit 2 more times in that same position. I would say at that point the armor is broken. The armor will have shattered. Whether it's from the kinetic injury or from the penetrating tip or a combination of the two, doesn't matter. Probably not going to get too many shots out of that. For the heavy bolter, 2 or 3 shots in a weak spot like that, 1 or 2 if it's in a real weak spot like the metal areas, and then I would say 3 or 4 if you're hitting in the chest or the shoulders. And the shoulders might be able to take a couple more, but really we're talking about like it could shatter the armor and very much could continue to injure the marine even if it doesn't penetrate through kinetic impact and secondary explosive. So moving on, Plasma and Melta. Melta is going to be better than Plasma, but it's very short range. Plasma, you want to hit a weaker spot, so thighs, waist, groin, arms, any of that, any spot that's like tangential to the actual protection, the heavy protection on the chest and shoulders, that's going to be a much more solid chance that you penetrate, or at least like, it's not necessarily that you penetrate with the plasma gun, it's more that you melt the armor onto the marine's flesh, and you kind of fuse bones, and you damage skin and muscle. You mess up the black carapace, so you weaken that limb and possibly disable it. Plasma weapons are very effective at like tagging a marine and causing a lot of damage. Killing a marine with them is going to require either a headshot, an overcharge shot to a weak spot like the stomach or arms or legs, to blow off a limb, because the overcharged plasma tends to detonate rather than just kind of melt like the normal plasma does. But in terms of hitting the chest and shoulders with plasma, the shoulders can take a solid beating. The chest, I've seen both ways. I've seen like 2 or 3 shots take down a marine, or at least incapacitate or seriously injure them. But I would say that 1 or 2 good overcharge shots, or 3 or 4 solid, like even not in the same place shots, will probably ruin the marine's breastplate and might incapacitate them. Melta, again, yeah, just it'll do it. It'll do the job. Melta does the job. Las cannons, if they're on the lower power setting, they might not penetrate the shoulders and chest. They will penetrate basically everywhere else. And if it's on the higher power setting, that really is the issue of, like, on the lower power setting, it might burn, it might cut through flesh, it might scorch bone, that kind of stuff. It'll hurt a lot, it might wound them, it might incapacitate a limb. But if it's on full power, you're going to be losing a limb. You're going to lose a hand, an arm. A lot of Marines have lost, like, knee down or elbow down from a las cannon shot. Las cannons, if they hit straight on the chest, they have a pretty solid chance of penetrating and hitting the Marine. The shoulders, on the other hand, they can slow it down, and you might even survive a full las cannon blast to the shoulder, but it's not a high chance, and you'll probably lose your arm as a result. So that's about as far as I'm going to go. When it comes to cannons or anything like that, just don't get hit. Because if you get shot with a battle cannon in the chest, and you're wearing power, it doesn't matter if you're wearing power armor. You're probably going to die or be incapacitated. If you get hit in a limb, it's probably coming off. It's a 120 millimeter shell. It doesn't matter how tough you are, or how blessed by the God Emperor or the Dark Gods you are. 120 millimeter cannon shell is going to destroy your armor. And again, anything above that, when we're talking auto cannons, similar thing to the bolter, 23, 25 millimeter, aim for weak spots. Anything above that, when we get to 37, 35, that'll defeat Astartes plate. 35 millimeter armor piercing rounds will shatter breastplates after a couple of shots. They'll break any of the armor other than the shoulder plates. And even with the shoulder plates, 3 or 4 good shots will absolutely crack. If not, maybe throw the Marine on his ass, considering how much kinetic energy is behind a 35 millimeter armor-piercing cannon round. You know, it's not a guarantee, but most of the time, if you get good shots in with armor-piercing rounds, you'll probably incapacitate them after a couple of shots that hit on square. Let me think. Did I forget about any weapons? No, I don't think I did. I'll go into Xenos ones and other stuff when we get to them, obviously. This is the basic power armor video, so I'm doing that. Movement, protection, weaknesses, penetration analysis. We've done penetration analysis like 7 times now. I'm not going to bore you again with it. So, Mark II Crusade, this is the one that comes after Thunder. This is the real Marine power armor. You'll see this glorious knight helm with the ridge that has the studs. It's got the upward-facing funnels, which I think are very cool. This one has a very lacquered, layered plating. These are very thin plates on the Mark II. They kind of are meant to interweave and add extra protection, but in reality, this is just kind of really thin, scalloped armor. It almost looks like plate armor. And on the elbows and stuff, again, it's like bolted into place. It's kind of flimsy, and even though it's scalloped and layered here, you can see that this breastplate does not extend down past the diaphragm, and these side plates are very restrictive to movement, or at least they seem restrictive, and they don't protect the center of the chest, the diaphragm, the lungs, very important parts of the Marine. Mark III Iron, one of my absolute favorite patterns of all time. I love the Iron so darn much. It's got a massive breastplate. It's extra armored. So it is essentially Mark II Crusade with another plate placed over this entire ensemble, protecting the diaphragm, protecting these extra side plates. It's got wider and thicker arm plates. These are like true protection. Its shoulder plates are bigger. It's got one solid piece for the calf, for the thigh. Though you'll notice that the back of it is still that layered, kind of laminated look of the Mark II Crusade. It kind of is that way, because the back of the Iron is always described as being weak, or, you know, relatively weak, but that's in terms of the Heresy. When most people are using Mark V Heresy armor, which is protected all around by thick ceramite, people in Iron are even more heavily protected than someone in Mark V Heresy armor, because of course they have a thicker plate, it goes down further on their stomach and chest, they have secondary plates, but in the rear, they still have these thin laminated plates that are kind of a holdover from the Crusade pattern. And of course, my favorite thing is that beautiful, kind of iconic Iron Warriors helmet. It's one of my absolute favorite 40k armor sets, no matter what. I love it so much. So, moving on to the Heresy, it's kind of direct competitor. Now, there's issues with Heresy. People say that it's, you know, it's a mix of patterns. It's not a real pattern. It's kind of a intermediate where they're mixing and matching armor. The most classic thing about the Heresy is kind of the Karn style, the screaming Vox grill, the half gorget, the extra sliced on or chopped on pieces like the big extra Vox. It's got a solid breastplate, but there's a section in the center. It's got very large pauldrons, but otherwise it's fairly standard with other power armor that we're more aware of. But the one thing about the Heresy that's unique, other than it having a more modern power pack, are these studs. Now you might say, why are there studs on power armor? Studs aren't actual protection. And I would agree, it isn't. This is actually proof of something that I have had arguments about before. The studs are proof that ceramite is likely to crack and shatter. Now you might say, why is that proof of that? These aren't just studs. They're not just shoved into the armor. They are bolts. There are bolts holding together this plate. So essentially, this big plate is kinetically weak. So it will shatter. They know that. They saw that with the Iron pattern, that this ceramite can shatter. It can compromise the armor's protection. So they put this in its place. This is effectively attached to all of the backing of the ceramite with an interleaved, like, cross-webbing of steel plates or of steel strips, so that if a bolt shell or if some damage happens to this section of the plate, it doesn't crack up further than this bolt, and it doesn't crack down further than this one, or to the left of this one, or to the right of this one. It essentially helps localize the damage and prevent catastrophic destruction of an entire plate. And that kind of plays into that thing of Ceramite is more protective against energy threats, and it can be vulnerable to high caliber kinetic threats. Now, I'm not saying an auto gun is going to shatter Space Marine armor like glass. That's not what I mean at all. But when I'm talking about auto cannons, when I'm talking about heavy bolters, I'm talking about bolters, that's what I'm talking about, cracking and shattering the armor. This is great proof of that being the case. And this happens during the Heresy a lot. They found out during the Heresy that Space Marine power armor was very capable of resisting bolt guns, and that they were having an issue with the traders having, more heavy weapons or having specialized bolter ammunition that was already able to crack their armor. The bolts are a great way that they resisted that, these studs, but also they just made better and thicker ceramite, which you'll see here with the Mark 8 Errant, or in my opinion, the pinnacle of modern power armor. It makes up for a lot of issues of the previous classes, and we'll go into that. So, Mark 8 Errant, it's got the modern power pack, the beautiful Imperial Aquila. It's got this massive throat covering, which, while I find it hilarious, it makes me want to pour in a whole bunch of Visaline or gas into his helmet and light his head on fire. Just for fun. But it protects his throat, his neck, from shells kind of skimming up into the Vox grill. Obviously, this is not the thickest material ever. You could definitely shatter it if you tried hard enough. His helmet is fairly standard. It's basically Mark 5, just with a couple extra gubbins and no studs. You notice that the Ceramite's a little thicker on his shoulder pads, and his shoulder pads are also way wider than Heresy. Again, that's the idea of the Marines are transferring more to fighting hunched in their kind of aiming with a gun style, more than the run-and-gun Heresy era, all-rounder Marines. Heavy breastplate, all one piece with the side armor. Obviously, there's a gap in between under the armpit still. There's gaps here, there's gaps here. Back of the knee, still a gap. But you can see, one smooth, solid plate covering all the legs. He's got a gut plate. This is, again, like that thing where there's lines through it. It could be a weak point, it could not. But either way, there's still spots here you can see underneath his breastplate. And where there is a gut plate, you can also see that there's room for things to come in under here, because it's meant to be flexible, and because the breastplate is two pieces, this one thinner, this one thicker, almost twice as thick, it looks like. There's going to be a gap underneath here. So the weak spots have decreased, but really they've just changed positions, and we have to work a little harder now. Welcome to Modern 40K. So, again, Mark 1 Thunder, kind of that more lacquered strip armor, and it's all kind of really thin. Some of it's steel, some of it's not great, etc. First Marine armor, Crusade pattern. It's got that samurai lacquered armor style. Iron pattern, again, my absolute favorite. This kind of classic artwork. Maximus pattern, the first one with a leaf-shaped Vox grill instead of a helmet-shaped one. It's got a couple of things that are kind of go into Heresy pattern, but the Heresy pattern is really denoted by the studs. I'm ignoring this one because it's everyone's favorite, and it's one of my least... I'm kidding. So, Corvus pattern, or the beaky helmet. It's just Heresy pattern, but with a couple of modifications. The legs are different. They're all one piece. The studs have been done away with because we've realized that we can just make the ceramite thicker, and it does about the same. Then Aquila pattern. This is the classic Marine, what people call the classic Firstborn pattern. This is what comes into modern 40K. And really is one of the top level designs, the Mark 7. The Errant is just taking everything that was an issue with the Mark 7 that was carried over from the Corvus and the Heresy patterns, all the weak points, all the, spots that were incomplete, but you can see the legs are almost exactly the same. The breastplate is only slightly different to encase him with the gorget. Power pack's the same. Shoulders are basically the same. Arms are a little bit different. He's got layered armor. He has flat sections. But, cleared up a couple of weak spots. That's really all the difference between Aquila and Errant. And I think this is beautiful art of Errant. I love using it. I love taking it and using it for Chaos Marines in my stories. It's one of my absolute favorite things because it's next to Iron. Errant is really growing on me. But my order of favorites would probably have to be Iron, Errant, and then Aquila. I like Heresy. It's probably an honorable mention for top 3. But Maximus and Corvus are definitely not my favorites. And Aquila is... it's iffy. I could take it or leave it. It could get a spot on the list. I don't really have an opinion too much. It's the basic one, it's iconic. All right. Variants of models. We have our lady, our martyred lady, Rose lady, whatever it may be, Adeptus Sororitas. So, Terminator armor, I'm going over it right now. Terminator armor is just thick power armor. It's got a lot of differences to it. It's more ancient, more venerable, harder to make, etc. I'm not doing it right now. I have an entire Terminator video where I'll be going over every single version of Terminator armor, including the human versions. Sororitas armor. Obviously, you have Our Lady. She doesn't have the internal black carapace of a Marine, so it's not that underskin implant. She just has the muscle suit. And you can see for hers, these are kind of cloth or very thin metal. So, unlike the Marine, where it's more like brackets, this is a lot more like a thin, how do I say it? Thin, like, strap. Like, this is not as much protection as the Marine has, obviously, because it's not a Marine using the armor. But it covers the body, it still provides artificial muscle, and it interfaces with her armor. Now, the Sororitas armor is about half as thin as the Marines, so I would say that none of her armor exceeds more than an inch in thickness, but that doesn't mean that it's all that worse. It still is going to be resistant to standard infantry weapons, anywhere that was resistant before on the Marine, where I was like, yeah, if you had a high enough caliber weapon or a high enough penetrating weapon, you can go for it. Same thing with the Adeptus Sororitas. She's a little bit more vulnerable to hell guns, those kind of medium penetration weapons. Maybe some specialty ammunition, Type 4 ammo, long lasses are going to damage her more. But the most protected part of her is her helm and her upper chest. Like, she's got a very thick, heavy, layered ceramite piece here. And these are all a mix of ceramite and metal. These kind of gauntlets, it's the same thing. It's accentuated, thin ceramite, similar to heavy carapace armor, except she has the addition of all the muscle suit stuff and the power that is in her power pack and helm. So when I say that Adeptus Sororita's armor is really more analogous in protection to the upper level of heavy carapace, while giving her all of the advantages of power armor, that's really what I mean. So she's coated in ceramite, head to toe, with kind of similar gaps to what the Marine has, but she's way thinner in terms of her protection. She's much closer to heavy carapace, an analogy, except she does away with the flak material and replaces it with that thick kind of metal muscle suit, the black carapace that she uses. And again, both of these help them with their heavy weapons. It helps them pull heavy things, fire bolt guns, all that stuff. All of them have inbuilt targeters and auspex in their helms. Very efficient, very cool, great for battle. Helps you resist shock, has medical stuff on board, mostly injectors and things of that nature. It's not like an auto surgeon or anything, but yeah, protective mostly, but her protection is more on par with the top end of heavy carapace, but she has all of the advantages of being in power armor instead of having all the disadvantages of having to lug around heavy carapace. Moving on. Xenos power armor. And Xenos and just other versions of power armor. Eldar suits are, again, like the sisters. They give them heavy carapace level protection, or just a bit above it. With the advantage that Eldar suits, like everything the Eldar do, are lighter, faster, colorful, and have kind of inbuilt weaponry in a lot of cases. They have shuriken launchers or things of that nature. I think there are some Dark Eldar suits that I would call power armor or powered armor. Kind of the really heavy carapace that they might wear. It looks like a lot of them probably wear the equivalent of light carapace, or sometimes even synthetic. But I have seen Dark Eldar wearing the same equivalent to what the Eldar wear. So, possible there. Orcs in full body armor are going to be resistant to, like, mecha knobs and knobs that have particularly good mech boys. Mech boys and their retinue. The other mech boys who are in the area, they're probably going to have something equivalent to power armor. And, of course, war bosses. War bosses' power armor is really a lot closer to taking a Mack truck and putting it on top of a very large orc than it is any type of design or process to really protect the orc. It is big, it is scary. Ghazghul's armor is so close to it to him looking like he just took Optimus Prime and used him as a skin cloak, essentially, that I almost want to call copyright infringement. I'm kidding. But yeah, for the orcs, their armor is powered the same way that their ships are powered, which means that it's moved around because they are so darn strong and so darn stupid that they don't realize that it doesn't work. So the Gestalt hive mind of the orcs believe that, of course, we can make power armor. There are other power armored or equivalent to power armored orcs, but they don't tend to use the fancy materials. They don't use ceramite. They don't use adamantium. And by the way, there is adamantium in power armor. I didn't mean earlier to imply that there's none of it in there. It's just not forming a large portion of the protection. Orcs will just use huge slabs of steel. Because what is wrong with a 45-pound plate of metal just being strapped to your chest? Nothing, apparently, because some of these orcs straight up look like they ate a Chevy Suburban and just vomited all over themselves. So, orcs have an interesting form of power armor. It is inferior, in so much that they are effectively lugging it around themselves. I'm not saying that their Gestalt doesn't help them move at all, but they are physically limited by the fact that their armor is way bigger than it needs to be. And it is steel armor, so it is actually less resistant in some cases than regular power armor because it lacks ceramite, it can be damaged by lasers more easily, and of course, like all orcish armor, it has gaps and it is not a perfect universal full body protection. Proto-humans. So during the Great Crusade, a lot of the time, the Imperium, would come across proto-human civilizations that had power armor. Now, this includes stuff like the Knights of Caliban, who had powered, knight armor. This would include individuals who would come under, resistance to humans. Some other Xenos would give powered mech suits to human warriors who were under their thrall. The enslavers had these. A lot of these designs during the Great Crusade became future power armor patterns. But these proto-human suits haven't just been lost to the Imperium. They exist on some worlds, some of them on the worlds that they originally came from, and they kind of range between a man-powered skid loader to some big clunky knight armor that has a V8 engine in the back, helping the knight kind of clank and clink along in his boisterously painted and well-maintained suit of archaic steel armor. Generally, these are made of metal, and like the orc armor, they have a lot of flaws, and the ones that are of a decent quality are probably no longer in use. But you will probably see worlds that have these in the absolute rarest of cases. So they might have, the Lord of the highest tower and the highest knighthood. He's a priest of the old ways, and he signed on to be the planetary governor, and he kept 5 suits of Artificer Mark 7 whatever power armor from the Great Crusade, and he's been keeping track of them. It's okay, so that dude basically just has, local power armor. Cool. It's not great. These are not very impressive. But, it's better than nothing. And in a battlefield where your biggest enemy is a knight on a horse, having literally the strength to rip the horse's head off, or at least break its neck with your bare hands, is an impressive advantage. Plus, when you can wield a 2-handed sword that's 7 feet long as if it were a 1-handed sword, yeah, people are going to be terrified of this proto-human power armor. Again, not common, but it exists, and I feel like I need to say it because it tees up some of the human power armor we'll be talking about later. Modern armors, and this is where I get into human power armor. So, Chaos Marines and Inquisition. We've already gone over Chaos. They use it. Chaos Demagogues can use it. Cultists can use it. There are examples. It's generally ones who manage to capture Forge Worlds and kill Marines who are using it. They modify it, put it back down to the size where they want to get it, and then there you go. You have power armor. Marines, obviously, power armor, standard. Light power armor that they use for their neophytes exists. But I will talk about the folly of light power armor and the light variants of power armor in a second. The Inquisition use power armor a lot. They either use what I call this is what I point to when I say, oh yes, proto-human power armor, or powered armor. Powered armor Things that like Crusaders use, what these two Inquisitors are both in, is metal doped with ceramite or metal enameled or faced with ceramite. So it's got like a light thermal resistance, but it's just heavy steel. And then it is powered like that clunky proto-human power armor. It's designed to protect them from a lot of damage and help them move around and walk and fight at a much higher strength level because, most Inquisitors are not yoked out at the gym pumping iron all the time like Adeptus Astartes get to. They're quite often going around in courts and stuff. They can't afford to be, all that intimidating, but on the battlefield they want to have powered armor to help them out. And this gives them a lot of strength and the ability to use weapons that they wouldn't usually get to. And, keep them alive, most important part. Again, humans we already went over, Inquisition we already went over. Let's go to light power armor. Now right here I have the Space Wolf Vanguard. The more common form of light power armor before a couple of years ago when the new power armor versions came out, Mark 10 and Mark 9 and all that, the post-errant versions. The light power armor that they used was really just powered armor, much like the Inquisition's armor, and it was used for neophytes. They would have kind of a proto-power armor that was a mix between the protection of heavy carapace and the power level of power armor. So it would have a small generator, similar in size to a Scion's backpack, and they would use that while they're training to prep them for power armor because it's got all the same system. It's got integration with kind of like a Black Carapace. I don't know if it used the actual Black Carapace system. But it was essentially light, and it was either training armor or in an emergency, training became combat, and they would go out in that as, scouts or snipers or something like that. The issue that I had, and the issue to a degree that I have with Corvus and the other light power armor patterns, including Vanguard, is Marines are not supposed to be sneaky or subtle. And I know that's a take. That's a real take there, a hot one. I am of the opinion that anything that takes away from the pure assets of a Marine, which is to say intimidation, speed, violence, and resistance, anything that takes away from that or limits that kind of primary objective is either going to be a waste of the Marine's talents or is going to just make him downright vulnerable. And this is one of the examples with Vanguard. Vanguard essentially takes off all of the armor plating from the lower half of the Marine. He's about as protected as a Marine in 4 marks ago. So I would actually argue that a Heresy-era Marine is more protected the legs down than a Vanguard. Yes, they are fast. They are not so fast that they can dodge bullets. They never have been. So I really always questioned, especially also Corvus was another one where it's like, yes, it's thinner and light and made for sneaking. That really strikes me as beyond a vulnerability into the level of insanity. You can't take away from a Marine one of the main things that makes them so good at their job and then send them into a theoretically dangerous situation. Like, if this was one set that was used when you had to infiltrate an area or maybe for a couple of squads, that's understandable. There are whole groups and mini companies and sets of squads equipped with this armor, and that really freaks me out because I'm like, are they just not caring about real protection? How much thinner are we talking? With Corvus, it seemed like they just cut it in half. They just stripped it down, took away the clanky bits, took away some of the coverings. That I could understand. It's not great. You never want to get into combat with less than your full rig because Marines are meant to operate with their full armor. They can train to not, but they're not as effective as Marines. And I always take it that since Marines are so precious, taking anything away from them, no matter what the mission, that makes them more vulnerable or makes them worse at their job, it is at best a calculated risk, and at worst it's a downright folly. It is a danger, and it is a concerning decision, if there is threats to behold, then it might be an issue. I'm undecided on this. It's a protection level thing. And there's plenty of ways to argue this, so I'm not going to, claim authority on the point. I just really dislike it. And the idea of Marines being stealthy, while, concealment is all well and good, and of course the Alpha Legion, the Raven Guard, and the Night Lords, they have their own versions of stealth, whether it's infiltration, in the case of the Alpha Legion, impersonation in case of the Alpha Legion, or surprise attack in case of the Night Lords. I love how, Night Lord stealth isn't like to get behind enemy lines, it's just to crush the enemy lines by surprise. My real concern is when I get to when I get to the Raven Guard, and it's like, ah yes, our stealth is actually genuine stealth. We go around at night in our power armor, and we try and be as quiet as possible. I'm like, you have a huge thermal signature. You are enormous. You are loud. Power armor is loud. There are versions of it that claim to be quiet, but there should not be any that claim to be silent. You have a nuclear reactor on your back. You have servos. You have springs and joints and joists of metal twisting at all times. You have clinking materials. You have all types of stuff strapped to your armor and equipment. Not to mention that you are constantly off-gassing a bunch of radioactive steam from the back of your armor. So don't tell me you're sneaking around at night past defenders. I know it happens in the lore. It's completely unreasonable at a certain distance because Marines are loud, even if they're not moving. Again, in books this is kind of made up for, but I really couldn't see a way that you can't hear a Marine coming. The footsteps alone, ignoring the rasping of the armor, ignoring the clinking and clanking of this thing moving around, ignoring even the sound of breathing or the click and crackle of vox chatter, any of that, just the power pack should make a low, consistent hum, as it is a literal reactor going off. So, people may disagree with me. I've had this argument many times before. I don't want to make too many waves. I know this is just a power armor video, but that is, my realism take on it, is that trying true ninja-like stealth with power armor can be ranging from, a concerning choice, a risky, a calculated risk, a calculated gamble, to downright insanity and downright folly. And I don't mean to denigrate anyone's chapter, I don't mean to make any waves, but it's the Raven Guard that I find most grievously affected by this issue of thinking that a Space Marine can hide in plain sight. Finally, acknowledgements. I kind of did go into it there, but that's the Power Armor video, y'all. I'm super happy I got this out. I'm probably going to have to wait a couple days. I got a busy time up ahead. This is way longer than it had to be. I apologize. I was thinking about doing some stuff for enemy factions in a bit. Going through like different classes of opponents and seeing what you want to do to damage them. I could do chapters, I could do anything like that. But for the moment, my layout is going to be going into Terminator armor, then going into melee weapons. I'm probably going to do chain and primitive first, and then power, or maybe the other way around. We'll see. I'd love to hear what people have to say. I'd also love to do one on all of different regiments, all the different types of regiments, what they have, what they're equipped with, good examples of all of them. So whatever you guys would like, I would love to hear comments and all the rest of it. And I wish you all a lovely good night.